My job tonight is to introduce Hosffman Ospino, who will in turn introduce at the appropriate moment the other two panelists. Hosffman was born in Colombia, where he pursued an undergraduate degree in philosophy and came to the United States and did in our School of Theology and Ministry an MA and then a PhD in theology and education. He's lectured nationally and internationally and in areas that he does his research, and he's very active in the Boston area in Hispanic ministry with his wife, Guadalupe. In 2014, he brought national attention not only to himself, but to the School of Theology and Ministry in Boston College with his publication of a national study entitled Hispanic Ministry in Catholic Parishes. It was a major study, widely disseminated, and if you go to the website, you'll find it there in PDF. You can read the whole thing. In addition, the Church in the 21st Century Center commissioned Hosffman to take a look at what we've been doing for the past 12 years and how our publications and our events were reaching out to Hispanic Catholics in the United States. And I'd have to say that the results of his careful study of what we've been doing ended with a conclusion, a disappointing conclusion, that we had not been as proactive as we needed to be. So his report, which started there, ended up with a series of recommendations how we could increase our outreach to the emerging Hispanic Catholic community in the United States. Steering committee, which I chair, and the advisory committee, which I co-chair of the center, have been discussing over the year Hosffman's report and recommendations, and I'll be happy to say that we're going to reach some conclusion by the end of this academic year, and when you come back next year, I think you'll see quite clearly that we have taken his recommendations to the center seriously, and that a new emphasis in our activities is going to be outreach to the Hispanic Catholic community in the United States. So we thank Hosffman for that great service he rendered to us. He's also on our steering committee, by the way. So tonight, I hope, is a small step in that outreach, which you'll see more of next year. So let me decease at the moment and introduce Hosffman Ospino.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bob and Karen, Ellie, for hosting us tonight in this important panel in conversation, keeping Hispanic immigrant families together, Catholic perspectives. No? So let me just give you a bit of a context within which this conversation is situated. No? So you and I know that Catholicism in the United States is changing, and it's changing dramatically fast. You know, only 60 years ago, 90% of all Catholics in the United States were white Euro-American children, grandchildren, the descendants of Catholics who came from Europe. Today, that group has pretty much is about half of all Catholics. And in the meantime, Hispanic Catholics has come to be the emerging minority, which in many parts of the country, particularly Texas, California, Arizona, New Mexico, has become the new Catholic, the new Catholic majority. So with those demographic changes, we also find changes in terms of culture, in terms of languages, and in terms of priorities, and I think that this is pretty much what drives this particular conversation. So technically, what we are seeing towards the end of the 20th century and early 21st century is what I want to call a new version of the immigrant church. No? So American Catholics, for many reasons, somehow look at the immigrant church as a thing of the past. But today we are immersed in what we call this new version of the immigrant church. And why? No, pretty much, we know that there are 20 million Hispanics in the United States who are immigrants, the majority Catholic. And these people are raising the next generation of Catholic in the United States. Altogether, along with immigrants from Asia, from Africa, we can pretty much say that about a third of all Catholics in this country share in that immigrant experience, whether as immigrants or second generation children of immigrants. So Hispanics, are at the center of the transformation of Catholicism. And Bob mentioned this national study that was conducted here at Boston College, for which I had the privilege of being the principal investigator. And there are about 4,500 parishes nationwide serving Hispanic Catholics. Most of these parishes are serving primarily immigrant Catholics. No? So that's how Hispanic ministry is defined, primarily in parishes in dioceses, serving the Hispanic immigrant population. And when we look at the dynamics of what's happening in parishes and dioceses, it's normal to see tensions, but also the reshifting of priorities in parishes. For instance, parishes that until 10, 20 years ago were mostly middle-class parishes, today are shifting their priorities and their programming because of the incoming presence of Latinos, but also Asians and other immigrants. So these needs and priorities are at different levels. For instance, Catholicism is quickly shifting in many parts of the country from what we could call a middle-class experience to a largely working-class experience with new concerns. And at the center of those concerns are the concerns of Hispanic families. Poverty, social dislocation, violence, and marginalization, among other ills, are part of the Latina experience, and because of the immigrant realities that many have to face. Most Latinos who have arrived in the United States, have low levels of education, are mostly poor people, and then when they settle in the United States, they also have to go through the struggles that every immigrant group in the United States has had to go throughout history. Language issues, new ways of being Catholic shape this new dynamic. And then what we see is thousands of parishes nationwide and dioceses reinventing themselves, as they wrestle, with this new presence and also with the questions that these communities are bringing. And at the heart of those questions is the question of family. And I think that that's what brings us together this evening. We know that thanks to the pontificate of Pope Francis and the synods that we are witnessing and that we are discussing in our communities, in our classrooms, we know that there is a renewed concern about the family. But what's worrisome sometimes is that a lot of the media and a lot of the attention immediately goes to the hot button issues when it comes down to the family, But what sometimes gets left out are the other big issues that families, particularly in this case, immigrant families, have to face, So if we were to name some of the hot button issues for Hispanic families, for instance, we would have to name generational differences, First, immigrant parents raising US-born children in the United States. We also have to deal with issues of deportation and family separation, immigrant reunification. So how can we address these issues intellectually, communally, theologically, ministerially? And that's what brings us together tonight on this particular panel. I'm honored to be on this panel tonight with two of the leading voices at the national level precisely on this question of of migration and how it impacts Hispanic families and Hispanic realities. First, I want to introduce you to my colleague, Mary Holper, who is an associate clinical professor and director of the immigration clinic at Boston College Law School. So we both share the privilege of teaching here at Boston College. Prior to joining the BCLS faculty, Professor Holper was an associate professor of law at Roger Williams University School of Law in Rhode Island, where she founded and directed the Roger Williams University School of Law Immigrant Clinic. Mary is going to be our first panelist today. And then our second panelist is going to be Donald Kerwin, Jr., who has directed the Center for Migration Studies of New York since September 2011. He previously worked for the Catholic Legal Immigration Network Clinic between 1992 and 2008, serving as its executive director for 15 years, and its interim executive director between September 2012 and March 2013. He currently serves on the board of directors for the Border Network of Human Rights in El Paso, Texas. Both are the best, They're brilliant, great insights, so please join me in welcoming both of these panelists.
Thank you. That was a very kind introduction, and I'm very excited to be here tonight and also on this panel with my former executive director of the organization. Back from 2005 to 2007, I was an attorney for the Catholic Legal Immigration Network, where I represented detainees, immigration detainees, and Don was my executive director there. So right now I direct the Immigration Law Clinic at BC, which my students for credit represent clients in their immigration matters and deportation cases and asylum cases. We've represented quite a few unaccompanied minors, even more so after last summer, the surge of kids coming over, and victims of domestic violence and their immigration relief. So sort of a full panoply of types of immigration cases are what me and my students handle. So I'm going to talk tonight about immigration and the family, and basically how does our current system keep families together or not keep families together. And I'm going to focus particularly on the law as a whole, just the immigration law and its structure and the way that it keeps families together and not. And then I'm going to talk more about immigration in the Obama administration, and particularly what the Obama administration has been doing on this issue. So just from a big macro level, I'm sure not everybody is familiar with the intricacies of immigration law and how it works, but since about 1965, there's been essentially 3 ways to get a green card, to get permanent residence in the United States. And one of those is through being a highly skilled worker, getting an employer to sponsor you. Another is through the diversity lottery. You basically win the lottery for a visa, which is just quite interesting. And then the third way is through your family connections, and that's because you have, say, a lawful permanent resident, someone with a green card who's a close family member, or a US citizen who's a close family member and can sponsor you and petition for you to get that legal status. So at first brush, it sort of appears that our immigration system cares deeply about family unification because we care about bringing together spouses, children, sometimes brothers and sisters. But there's a few flaws in just the way that our system works, in that our definition of family in the way immigration law defines it isn't necessarily consistent with the way the rest of the world may define a family relationship or a family unit. So take, for example, we have several clients who were raised by their grandparents, and their grandparents were essentially stand-in parents for them, especially with Central American families where the grandparent or the parent may have gone off to live in the United States, to work, to send money home, and then the child is with the grandparent and sees that grandparent as essentially a parent. Should that child later get status here in the United States, he can't petition for his grandparent as a parent because that relationship isn't recognized as a parent-child relationship in the way that it would be recognized with the biological parent. So that's one place where the sort of rest of the world and the way that they treat their family units is somewhat inconsistent with the way that immigration law treats a family. So the lack of category for grandparents altogether. There's no categories for cousins. I have many, many clients who see their cousins as essentially like siblings, but they don't get to petition for they don't get to sponsor their cousins. That relationship for immigration law purposes essentially means almost nothing. And then finally, for the US citizen siblings, there's a long, very, very slow line for them to stand in. So you may know that US citizens can petition for their siblings to come, but right now, if they filed a case in 2002, they would just be reunifiting with their siblings here in the United States. So they've been waiting for quite some time. And if that sibling happens to hail from Mexico, they're now deciding cases from 1997. So you're looking at many, many years before your siblings could be reunited. And again, this is where I think it's just inconsistent with the way the rest of the world views family, because many of my clients have been raised by older siblings almost as though that older sibling was their parent. So you wonder, okay, well, there's an adoption, can't a grandparent or a sibling adopt their brother or sister, their grandchild? And while that's true, and that could get recognized for this to sort of get the beneficial immigration law treatment of this parent-child relationship, it requires some sort of formal process of adopting the child and living together for at least 2 years before the child reached a certain age, 16. And it's just very not common, I have seen, that someone goes through the formalities of actually filling out all the adoption paperwork, goes to family court in Guatemala to actually formally adopt this child. It's much more common that they just sort of take them in and they become their own and they raise them as their child. But that sort of relationship, because it just doesn't have the preferential treatment in immigration law, they don't get to stay together in the same way. So another issue with family and the way I see the structure of our immigration laws and the way that we enforce our immigration laws that doesn't quite keep families together is through immigration law's obsession with fraud. So if I, say, have a family member who I want to bring here, I have to prove that I have that relationship. It's not enough for me to say, my child is over there, he's in Guatemala, and I want to bring him. I have to produce a birth certificate. This is the type of documentation that can't always be easily obtained. I remember trying to obtain this from a client in Haiti after the earthquake, and it was near impossible to just get this piece of paper that proved this relationship between these two. And I understand, because the concern is you could just make up that you have a relationship with half the population of Guatemala, and then half the population of Guatemala could come as your children. So that underlying concern for fraud is real and legit, but it creates this problem of, and it can create a very strict scrutiny of the documents. And in much of the world, the documentation isn't quite as perfect as what we would like here, where the birth certificates are there, but they're either just really hard to come by, or they just don't have the perfections of the way it might be processed here in the United States. So, so you see a lot of different families unable to reunite because of an issue of essentially bad documents that is very much an issue of other parts of the world not having the perfect or near perfect record-keeping practices. Another issue with our immigration system right now that is failing to protect the family unit is the deportation system. And so since 1996, that's the last time we saw a major overhaul to our deportation system. And there was a pair of laws that created a deportation system where it was very easy for lawful permanent residents, so those are people who are green card holders, who came here legally, to be deported for the most minor of offenses. And if you haven't heard this term yet, there's an immigration law term called aggravated felonies that is a term of art because it doesn't have to be aggravated and it doesn't have to be a felony. So it's this category of crimes that was created by Congress in 1988, expanded every time the law was amended up until 1996. And then in 1996, now it's basically a behemoth, and it covers, there's something like 23 categories ranging from a misdemeanor first-time theft offense can count, a simple drug possession can count, and on to the most serious things like murder that you would think would fit into this category. So the issue with the aggravated felony category is it means that for lawful permanent residents, they can't go to an immigration judge and ask for a second chance, even if they've been living here for years since they were young kids, even if they have a whole slew of US citizen family, including a spouse and children and grandchildren, and cousins and everybody else and a whole network of people. Those relationships are essentially meaningless to a judge because of this crime. So they're classified first by their crime and such that the judge can't reach the individual equities of their case. So just as an example, I have a client who I represented who had entered the US as a lawful permanent resident in 1969. She had 5 kids, 14 grandchildren. During a rough patch in her life, she had been twice convicted of possession of controlled substances. In 2009, when she was 60 years old, she was detained for 2 years in an immigration jail down in Bristol County, and then finally got out of jail. Ultimately, her case was appealed all the way up to the federal court, and she lost. And then thankfully, because we got a criminal lawyer involved and he was able to convince the prosecutors to overturn her conviction, she finally got out from under that deportation order. But this is with the help of 4 immigration lawyers, basically, or 4 different lawyers trying to help her case. This is a poor woman who just had the good luck of coming in contact with my clinic, and then I had, friends who could help me piece together this whole representation. And she managed to get out from under it, but otherwise she would have, probably been in detention for maybe a year or so more, probably been deported to the Dominican Republic. And again, this is a woman who was 60 years old, and this crime had been, had happened in her life, and she acknowledged it, and she was very remorseful for it. But it was no second chances. You have this type of crime, and you're going. So those are, from just a broad brush perspective, what I see as things that are wrong with our current system and the laws that don't keep families together. So what's happened in the Obama administration? So first of all, what has not happened in the Obama administration is comprehensive immigration reform. I'm sure Don can speak a little bit more to all the various attempts. He's been much more involved in the policy work behind that of trying to get something passed, as in a legalization for people who are the 11 million who are undocumented here in the United States, a path to a green card. So the Obama administration has not been able to make that happen. So what he's been able to do instead is a series of executive actions, and the difference, of course, is that he's not, things that didn't have to go through Congress. So ensuring a path to a green card has to go through Congress. Saying that we're just not going to deport a certain type of people is something that the president can do unilaterally. And that's what you see this president having done more, because he feels like he doesn't have the support of Congress, and it's true, Congress isn't going to pass anything that's going to grant legalization to the 11 million undocumented here in the United States. So you're probably all familiar with the November of 2014 announcement by President Obama of what we call DAPA, Deferred Action for Parental Accountability. And this was what I think some people think of as President Obama legalizing a whole bunch of undocumented people in the United States. That's not what he did. He announced that he would not deport, or he would set out a policy that his administration, the Department of Homeland Security, who works under him, would not deport families. They would not deport parents of US citizens and parents of lawful permanent residents. And that's the announcement that was made in November. And because the way that he stated this was, I'm going to make sure these people don't get deported, and I will grant them deferred action, which is sort of a recognition of the status that we're not going to deport you, and that happens to come with work permits. That was, for many, sort of a godsend. Now we're going to have an actual legal ability to work in the United States. And if you haven't listened to his speech where he rolled out this announcement, it was very much from a place of, we need to keep families together. So he's saying things like, we are a nation who values families and works together to keep them together. And you know, that these people, the undocumented, they support their families, they worship at our churches, many of their kids are American born or spent their entire lives here, and their hopes, dreams, patriotism are just like ours. They are part of American life. So this is what you hear Obama saying. So it's a very family-friendly rhetoric, and ultimately a very family-friendly action because of your connection to this US citizen child or this lawful permanent resident child. You can't be deported. You won't be deported by this administration. Now, unfortunately, that particular order is blocked by a judge in Texas. There are several states who sued the government, who sued the administration, trying to block that. The status of that right now is it is still blocked. It is still not going forward. There are arguments about that legal case in the Court of Appeals down in Texas that are happening in April, in mid-April. So hopefully we will know within the next month or so whether that program will go forward. But that's one place where you see the Obama administration valuing keeping families together through its immigration policies. Another one, and this is sort of a bizarre technicality of immigration law, is that if I have a client who's married to a US citizen and you think, great, married to a US citizen, you can get a green card, right? Not so, not if they entered the country without inspection, not if they slipped across the border, which unfortunately happens to account for a large volume of the undocumented population. So for those people, even with the US citizen spouse, they can't get the green card unless they go back home first. And the problem is they go back home, and there's a law enacted in 1996 as well that says if you've been here for over a year and you go home, now you can't come back in for 10 years. So what are the spouses of US citizens to do? Because they're being told, well, you can't just apply for a green card here because you entered illegally. You have to go home, but then you go home and you got to wait in line for 10 years to come back in to actually be reunited with your spouse. And of course, that marriage could completely fall apart in the 10 years you're waiting outside the United States. Now, there's a waiver of that unlawful presence that you could sort of skip waiting 10 years if you can show extreme hardship to a spouse, to a parent who's a citizen or a permanent resident. The problem, of course, is that you had to go back home gambling and wondering whether that waiver was going to happen and potentially be subject to being outside the United States for 10 years. So what Obama did through a regulation back in January of 2013 was say, you can ask for that waiver here and we'll grant it to you before you leave, and then you'll know that you can come back in safely. So that was one way that the Obama administration really helped in bringing the family unit together and ultimately being able to get the path to citizenship for people who had the right, because they had the right relationship, but just preventing them from having to go home for 10 years and wait outside the United States with the uncertainty that went along with that. And then another thing that the Obama administration did back in August of 2013 was the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is the agency that is the part of Department of Homeland Security that's responsible for detaining and deporting people. What they had realized was that many people, once they got caught up in the detention and the deportation system, was that the child welfare authorities for the children started to take their kids away. So the kids being left without parents or without care and protection, all of a sudden were being put into foster care. And the issue was that the parents wanted to fight this. They wanted to fight for their parental rights, but they got lost in the system. They had lawyers appointed to them to help them in their parental rights case, but the lawyers couldn't find them because they were somewhere in the detention labyrinth They were transferred all around the country. And the immigration authorities couldn't really guarantee that they'd be brought back to the family court to fight to hang on to their rights as a parent. So the Immigration and Customs Enforcement back in 2013 created an initiative to sort of facilitate for detained parents, for deported parents, getting back into the United States for the deported parents, and for the detained parents, making sure that they weren't detained too far away from where these child custody proceedings were going on, and making sure that they could easily get to the state family court to fight for their parental rights. So that was one. There's imperfections with that initiative in the way it has played out, but that's another way that the Obama administration has been fairly family friendly. And then finally, and most recently in November of 2014, in addition to announcing this broad policy that people wouldn't be deported if they had these types of relationships, the Obama administration came up with its newest memo about when people should be detained and deported, like who should we prioritize for detention and deportation. And the message was, we're not prioritizing people who are parents and who are legal guardians of children. That is not a priority for detention. So that was certainly a plus. So I would say overall, I could say that the Obama administration has mostly scored on the pluses for keeping families together through its immigration policies.
Well, I wanted to thank the Church in the 21st Century for having us and for hosting this event. Particularly happy to be speaking with two heroes of mine, Hosffman and Mary, who are terrific kind of people. Hosffman's really the expert on Catholic parishes these days, practical theology, and also on a commission that we have that looks at immigrant integration nationally. So I'm honored to be with him, and Mary was one of the best attorneys that we had at clinic, working in detention centers, which is really, really difficult work. So it's very nice to be here with her too. So what I've been asked to do is explain what the bishops do, I guess, and also to talk about why we haven't gotten immigration reform. But actually what I'm going to speak, I will speak about that, but mostly I'm going to speak about how the U.S. immigration system affects Hispanic families. And I'm going to try to talk about that through the lens of Catholic social teaching, the work of Catholic institutions. And let me start, Pope Benedict XVI said that the human person always has to be front and center. It always has to be in our hearts and minds when we talk about international migration. So let's start with some typical migrant narratives. Nothing spectacular, just typical, because I think in a way they're more powerful. My husband and I came to this country many years ago. We had no future in Mexico, no home, no land to farm, nothing. So we came north. We were hungry. We had children. We packed up what we could and we came north. It was the hardest thing I have ever done in my life, but you see, I had to for my children. That's like a typical theme, right? The theme of self-sacrifice for kids. And you see that over and over and over again in these narratives. Or I often think of this 17-year-old Haitian boy whose father, a government official, had been killed, and the dad's body had been left by the side of the road in Haiti for the dogs to eat as a kind of abject lesson and warning for others. The boy had been on the run for 5 months, and his mother had saved money, and ultimately he'd been able to come to the United States by boat. And he was living with his cousin in Silver Spring, Maryland. Was stacking groceries in the local Safeway, and he was trying to negotiate going to American high school all at the same time. And he seemed to me to be exactly the kind of person that we'd want in this country, right? He was humble, he was hardworking, he was self-effacing, he was courageous. He was kind of one of these anonymous heroes, and I think of him a lot. He was one of my, when I started at clinic, a client of mine. And I think too on a fact-finding trip of a delegation to Central America and to Mexico, interviewing a child in a shelter in Mexico. And the young man wept, and it really affected everybody because he was not weeping because he was detained or separated from his family, from his siblings, but because he had been sent to support them, and he was going to be returning home empty-handed. He felt that he had failed his family. So the question is, how does the church view people who give of themselves for their families, or who leave loved ones behind just so that they can survive? And I think, a bedrock principle of Catholic teaching comes into play here, and that is that people become fully human in giving of themselves to others, what Benedict called the disinterested gift of the self. That's very powerful. I mean, just to keep that in mind as we talk about these things. And I also think about what's the alternative vision, and we had that last week with the House Judiciary Committee, who reported out of committee a bill called the Comprehensive Mass Deportation Act. It's kind of so bad and historically so evocative, their version of comprehensive immigration reform, that you almost have to laugh. But among the other harsh and discredited measures in this bill was a measure that would criminalize unlawful presence, right? Now, it's been a crime for a long time to illegally cross a border, but it's never been a crime just to be unauthorized, to walk around or to breathe or to sleep or to eat in unauthorized status. And the committee wanted to correct that terrible mistake and to make some kind of a symbolic point. And I think about symbolism a lot. In Holy Week, I guess we all should, how symbols mediate deeper truths and how they're signs and instruments. And you wonder kind of what's the instrument here? It's really an instrument, in this case, of derision and marginalization of people, and a sign that these people are totally outside the law's protections and bounds, totally outside, make it illegal just to be. So under 744, the bill that passed the Senate during the last Congress, which is the 113th Congress, it would have taken 13 years for an unauthorized person to earn the right to permanent status in the United States. 13 years. They would have had to work during that time, good moral character, learn English, pay a heavy fine, go to the back of the line. And that's, to be honest, that's where a lot of them already are, right? They've already been tentatively approved for a visa and they're waiting for one. So that's hardly a giveaway, right? It's hardly an amnesty. And amnesty is kind of the market-tested word that's used to enrage people by politicians who oppose legalization. They did very careful market testing on this. But we might ask ourselves, particularly I think during Holy Week, it's appropriate to do so, what's so offensive about amnesty anyway? I mean, what's so bad about forgiving and forgetting transgressions? Aren't we the church of acknowledged sinners, don't we view ourselves as the beneficiaries of the greatest of all amnesties, particularly this week, Weren't the sabbatical and the Jubilee years in the Old Testament, which restored all members of the community to full membership in the community, weren't those amnesties of a sort? And don't our legal immigration categories, which haven't been meaningfully revised since 1990 and haven't been overhauled since 1965, that's 50 years, don't they lag behind our national interests? Think about how the world's changed over the last 50 years. See, the fact is, you can keep trying to criminalize self-sacrificing people until you're blue in the face, demagogue this issue forever, but it doesn't make it true. So let's talk about who these alleged criminals are. They include 4.4 million family members of U.S. citizens, lawful permanent residents, whose visa petitions, whose family-based visa petitions, even in those narrow categories that Mary was talking about, have been approved, who are waiting in backlogs. We hear a lot about these folks want to cut the line. The truth is, these people are the line, right? They're in the line, they are the line. The great majority of those people, that 4.4 million unauthorized people, are here in the United States, not abroad, okay? According to my agency's estimates, they include 3.9 million unauthorized parents of U.S. citizen children or lawful permanent resident children. That's another 4 million. Of course, there's some overlap here. They include 1.9 million people who've been here for 20 years or more. 6.6 million of the 11 million have been here for 10 years or more. They include 1.5 million brought to the U.S. as children who would qualify for the expanded action program to cover these people. And they include more than 5% of the U.S. workforce, and of course, far higher percentages in certain types of jobs. In a lot of cases, there aren't sufficient numbers of U.S. citizens to do. They're a population that commits non-immigration crimes at far lower rates than U.S. citizens, these criminals. Nearly 75% of them are Hispanic, and we trust them to care for our children, to care for our elderly, to pick our crops, to cook our food, to work in our yards, to build our homes. They're really the least likely criminals you'd ever meet. Least likely. Who they are is our family members, they're our friends, they're our co-religionists, they're our colleagues at work. The fact is, they're us. And that's what Catholic teaching says. And if you're Catholic, and if you're Hispanic, they're really us, okay? Hispanics now represent 35%, maybe it's higher than that even, 35 to 40% of U.S. Catholics, including 58% of Catholics between the ages of 18 to 34, those are the millennials, and 67% of Catholics that regularly go to church, of millennials that regularly go to church. 67%. That's the future of the church right there. So here's a core Catholic principle. People created in God's image can't be illegal. If they are, then God, who created them, is this terrible transgressor. God's a scofflaw. God didn't create illegal mothers or illegal fathers or illegal brothers and sisters. So how did the U.S. bishops frame immigration issues from the perspective of Catholic teaching? How does it look? How do the bishops look at this phenomenon? And I encourage you to read the 2003 pastoral statement that they did with the Mexican bishops called Strangers No Longer. It's kind of, it's still quite relevant, and it's a very strong document. So the first principle in looking at migration is that nations have a responsibility to provide the basic conditions that allow their members to stay and flourish in the countries in which they're born. Conversely, their citizens have a right not to have to migrate, okay? Notice that the church always uses this language of rights and responsibilities together. People think about rights as kind of a giveaway. Somebody gets a right and other people lose something. For the church, it's always rights and responsibilities. So when people can't sustain themselves, however, in their families, they have a right and a responsibility to seek better lives. And this is always in the context of families. One of the most basic of theories of migration. It's in most cases a family decision about risk management and even family survival. That's the migration decision. These aren't individual decisions in most cases. In making those very difficult choices and sacrifices for families, migrants are being called to do, are doing what they're being called to do. That's the way the bishops look at it. And when you ask migrants on the U.S.-Mexico border why they risk their lives to come, and I did a whole report on this, they usually explain some version of, well, it's better than dying slowly at home or watching your children die slowly at home. No opportunities. We had to do it. Better die trying to cross. So that's the first principle. The right not to have to migrate. Second principle, when people have to migrate, nations have a responsibility to receive those who are migrating to realize their God-given dignity to the extent that the common good permits. Yes, states can and should regulate migration. The bishops have never taken an open borders position, although they constantly get accused of that. States can keep out or remove migrants who aren't fleeing intense poverty or persecution or when the common good requires it. However, migrant rights and the authority of the sovereign to regulate migration, it's not about a balancing test either, right? It's not about a balancing test. And this is really powerful language, I think, from Strangers No Longer. What the bishop said is, the church recognizes the right of a sovereign state to control its borders and furtherance of the common good. It also recognizes the right of people to migrate so that they can realize their God-given rights. These teachings, they're not at odds, they're not balance, these teachings complement each other. While the sovereign state may impose reasonable limits on immigration, the common good is not served when the basic human rights of the individual are violated. The bishops have also taught that the common good applies to undocumented people, people without documents. Prior to the nation's last large-scale legalization bill, they said it's against the common good and unacceptable to have a double society, one visible with rights and one invisible without rights, a voiceless underground of undocumented persons. The third principle is that immigrants have a right and a responsibility to contribute to the good of their communities. Catholic teaching uses this term, contributive justice, to refer to social justice. The two are kind of interchangeable. And the basic idea is that social justice requires that states allow their residents to contribute or to participate. Like a lot of people at this point would interrupt me and say, okay, so what about the rule of law? And I guess, like how I'd respond to that, and the bishops too, is that they support this concept, and they also recognize the generosity of U.S. laws in many ways. We're admitting 1 million people per year legally. But there's a sense in the public debate too that the rule of law means rule by law. As long as you do things by the law, here's what we'll do. We'll criminalize presence here. And we'll act on it, and we're acting by the law then. If that was what the rule of law actually meant, like China would be the ultimate example of a country that upheld the rule of law. Rather, what the rule of law speaks to, thick sense of it, is the need for legal systems to safeguard human rights, including the right to family unity, to uphold due process, and when there's punishments, for those punishments to be proportional to the violation. The rule of law is about protecting people within the law, not coming up with more and more ingenious ways to marginalize people and put them outside the law's protection, and frankly, to expose them to criminal predation themselves, which is what a lot of these laws do to immigrants. And the rule of law sure doesn't mean that the law can't change. It's an aspiration. It kind of requires change. It's something that legal systems are constantly trying to seek, become a rule of law legal system. So based on these principles, what the bishops did is they created this Justice for Immigrants campaign. And the campaign, in terms of reforms, it supports an earned path to citizenship for a large percentage of the U.S. unauthorized. It strongly backs the DREAM Act and the Agricultural Job Act for agricultural workers. And they also support reform of the underlying legal immigration system. And I think this is the prong of comprehensive or broad reform that receives the least attention, but it's the most important because the immigration laws are so outdated and they're so misaligned with family and labor and economic needs. Third, the bishops have championed forever robust refugee protection policies that would allow people fleeing danger to reach into secure protection. They've advocated for greater due process protection for those facing removal, and they support immigration enforcement. However, I think what they'd argue is that it's very difficult to enforce the law in an effective and humane way when you have 11 million unauthorized people out there. Very difficult. And when you have the legal immigration system that we had. That's why comprehensive immigration reform, that's why you have to do all of these things together. The truth is we've had reform, and what it's been is enforcement reform. And it's been enforcement growth. If you don't believe me, you will after this. Let me give you some numbers. In 1990, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, which handled all kinds of immigration benefits too, not just enforcement, its budget was $1.2 billion, that's 1990. In 2013, the combined budgets of the Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which are the two main immigration enforcement agencies in the Department of Homeland Security, not the only agencies in the federal government or in DHS that do immigration enforcement, but the two main ones only, received $18 billion in appropriations. $18 billion compared to $1.2 billion for everything. What does $18 billion mean? Well, it's more than the FBI gets. It's more than the DEA gets. It's more than the Secret Service gets. It's more than the U.S. Marshals get. It's more than the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives gets. More than the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division. More than the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. More than the National Labor Relations Board. More than all the states' labor standards enforcement agencies combined. Here's the catch. It exceeds the funding for all of these agencies combined. Right? So you ask yourself, what opportunities are foregone, even in criminal justice, even in law enforcement, because we spend what we do on enforcing our immigration laws. The Obama administration has deported as many people in 6 years as the last 20 years of the 3 Republican administrations. This is one thing that he is criticized for in terms of division of families. The U.S. criminally prosecutes about 90,000 to 100,000 people per year and then deports them so that they have a criminal record for illegally crossing. And the ICE detention system is the largest prison system in the country. In 1996, it detained about 80,000 people per year. Right now, it detains 500,000 per year. So this is an immense system. And in many ways, immigrant detainees are treated worse than criminal defendants. For example, most of them are mandatory detainees. They can't be released, they can't get bonded out. And just about every criminal defendant can at least be considered for bond. So it would really kind of be difficult, and the reason I belabor this, it would be very difficult to think about Hispanic families that weren't affected by this in some way, particularly those that had an unauthorized person. Of course, that's what mixed status families are. And it'd be almost impossible, I think, to find a Hispanic ministry program not confronted with divided families or the corrosive day-to-day pressure on mixed status families. This is just a reality of Hispanic ministry. What does it mean? Recent reports have documented the removal in 2013 of 72,000 people who claim to have U.S.-born children. 15% of the 700,000 migrants apprehended along the U.S.-Mexico border in 2011, 2012 were the parents of U.S. citizen children. There's reports on the legal severance of parent-child relationships in thousands of cases each year as a result of the detention and removal of parents. Several studies have highlighted the violence and privation of the Central American and Mexican children, but they've been fleeing coming here. But a recent study that we published showed that, yeah, they're fleeing poverty and they're fleeing violence, but they also have family here at high rates. They're coming to join parents. It's a family reunification thing that's happening too. Another study that we published is based on interviews with 1,000 recently deported people in 6 cities in Mexico, and it found that immigration enforcement practices and programs do nothing to deter illegal entry for people that have family and homes in the United States. In other words, people will do anything to reunify with family members, or to safeguard family members. What does it look like on a human level when families are separated? The Urban Institute did a report on this, on kids, and the effect on kids. This is their conclusions. The kids had difficulty eating and sleeping. Many of them cried excessively. Some showed signs of withdrawal, others aggression. Speech patterns changed. Absenteeism from school increased. Academic performance declined. They were living in families that were suffering economic instability, hardship. They were moving constantly, struggling to pay bills, struggling to get enough to eat, and often moving into crowded housing with other families. What have the bishops been doing? Well, you know, I'm a really robust supporter of the bishops' work on this. I think they've been extraordinarily countercultural and very brave on these issues. And they take huge amounts of heat. They do a lot of work publicly, and they do a lot more important work privately. They're constantly writing, speaking to, meeting with elected officials on all levels of government, top to the bottom, federal, state, and local. The Justice for Immigrants campaign, if you don't belong, I hope you'll consider joining. It's got tens of thousands of people that regularly Religious communities have been active on immigration reform issues as well. Parishes have, student groups, Catholic agencies have, and others. My own agency has been coordinating a process of engagement with leaders from many types of Catholic institutions, programs. We call it the Catholic Immigrant Integration Project, although that's kind of a small project. And we use that word Catholic, or integration, in the thick Catholic sense of trying to build communion. I mean, can we get beyond and be a church again and stop fighting about like immigration reform authorized and start talking about building community between natives and newcomers based on common values and beliefs that can be found in all cultures, imperfectly, but they're in all cultures. The goal being to permit everybody to flourish. What the initiative asks is, are Catholic institutions doing for today's immigrants and their children what they did for past generations of immigrants, what they were created to do 100 years ago, 50 years ago? How can we expand and strengthen our institutional work collectively in serving, empowering, and contributing to integration? How can we open our institutions fully to the gifts and contributions of immigrants? Part of this process has involved examining what the church is already doing, which is impressive and pretty surprising, even to somebody like me who's been around for a long time. I was very surprised to see, I think parishes provide social services to immigrants about 60-65%. Many are the locus of superb parish-based organizing for social justice, and this is particularly true in immigrant communities. The Catholic Legal Immigration Network, which Mary and I were involved in for years, that supports 260 legal programs represent 250,000 immigrants per year. That's a lot of work. Catholic network of refugee resettlement agencies has resettled 1 million refugees since 1975. Catholic Charities serves 1 in every 10 persons in poverty per year, a large percentage of them immigrants. Catholic hospitals and health centers don't track whether they serve immigrants or not, but they care for 93 million people. Notre Dame University is now in kind of the process to increase Hispanic enrollment in Catholic schools. Only about 3% of Hispanic school children go to Catholic schools. This is a very, very important project and a very important need. So I think that just gives you kind of a broad sense, but Catholic institutions are doing a lot, but they're not doing enough. And there's a clear outline here of a win-win situation, kind of a convergence of immigrant needs, church needs too. Immigrants in the growing second and third generations, they need Catholic institutions. They clearly do. They earn less than natives. They have lower levels of education. They suffer workplace injuries at high rates. They're uninsured at low rates. 67% of the unauthorized lack health coverage. 28% are below the poverty line. And here's the truth. Catholic institutions badly need immigrants in their children as well. They need their faith, they need their hard work, they need their youth, they need their vitality, they need their optimism, they need their commitment to family. They need it all. There's an opportunity here to revitalize the church. The question is, are we going to grasp that opportunity? Are we going to embrace it? In conclusion, what I'd like to say is I think too many people in the public life view immigrants as a problem. Yet in our tradition, the Catholic tradition, immigrants have always been a constant source of religious renewal and civic renewal, and this can happen again. Pope Francis has beautifully articulated this vision of immigrants as a gift and an opportunity for us all. And how he put it, let me end with it. He said, "Migrants and refugees are an occasion that Providence gives us to build a more just society, more perfect democracy, more united country, a more fraternal world, a more open and evangelical Christian community. Migration can offer possibilities for a new evangelization, open vistas for the growth of a new humanity foreshadowed in the paschal mystery, humanity for which every foreign country is a homeland, every homeland is a foreign country. Not a problem, a solution, not a burden, a gift. That's the Catholic vision. Thank you.